I always said to Ron, we're definitely going to be competing hard with the innovation session and the other work streams, but it's great to have everyone here. I suppose you probably saw Louis Da Silva's presentation before the break, and I'm just wondering, like, are people inspired by the opportunity of 5G? What do people think? It's going to be transformational? Anyone?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, hands up. Anyone thinks it's going to be like 5G is like going to be amazing? No.
Still trying to see what will actually make it amazing.
Yeah, because I think really what we're seeing at the moment is 5G is more a marketing buzzword. In fact, it's like an extension of 4G. What we're seeing in cities. And I think you probably heard that kind of narrative from Louis. But I'm just going to talk through maybe I suppose our experience from Dublin City Council, and I'm working with Jake and his colleagues in the department in terms of what 5G, what we're seeing maybe as some of the opportunities, but also some of the challenges that we need to face from a regulatory and a policy perspective. So it's the city view, it's not the operator view, it's not the vendor view, it's actually what do we need to do in cities to enable this future opportunity. And there's lots of challenges, I can tell you, on that. You probably, I mean, I'll skip through some of this stuff, but Louis did a good job talking about the 5G characteristics, so I don't need to cover that. You probably showed the pictures of as the mobile devices, get to the level they're at now, and how that's going to really change, what we can do and the services that we can deliver. But essentially, the low latency, the massive connectivity, and the enhanced mobile broadband are the characteristics we're starting to see with 4G plus, and as we move into 5G. Essentially, 5G is only evolving. Like, if you think about the standards, and again, probably this was covered earlier, we're only into the first kind of release 15, which is kind of talking about what the standards of 5G are. So essentially, a lot of the things that we're doing is still in the 4G plus space. We can still get like massive speeds. The latency, will get better in terms of 5G. But when people talk about 5G, it is more a marketing term. And we're going to see lots of new iterations of 5G, and probably in another 10 years we'll have 6G. It's kind of there's a life cycles of each of these Gs. Who knows what 6G will be, but we'll wait and see. So you can see 2019, 2021. These are the standards that are being written as the technology evolves. And I guess, what we haven't seen yet in Ireland, we haven't seen the kind of millimetre wave kind of spectrum being utilised, which is this bit towards the 300 gigahertz, or, where you're starting to see connected drones and all these new applications. What the spectrum auction was recently, I think it was around the 3.6 gigahertz and around the kind of the middle to the left area that's leveraging some of the spectrum that can enable 5G type applications. And you've got the three operators in a company called Densair have purchased some of that spectrum. I do also kind of need to ask the question, maybe this isn't as clear, but 4G, it's not like we've got amazing coverage on 4G at the moment. We probably all have black spots. We switch to Wi-Fi. Parts of the country isn't connected very well. So you kind of question in terms of what will 5G look like for Ireland. Will it just be pockets of coverage across cities? How will this impact towns and villages? It's all questions that we need to ask ourselves as we look at these spectrum auctions and what the conditions are in terms of coverage. And I think from a pure marketing spin, Vodafone, without having a 5G core network, got all the kind of all the PR a couple of months ago in terms of launching what really is it a 5G network. I don't think anyone would quite believe that. And this map here is actually Air now are about to launch a 5G network nationally by the end of the month. In fact, actually, this is kind of what their coverage is going to look like around Dublin. So they've actually put a lot more investment in terms of their 5G network. I think Air are really starting to transform with low-cost mobile packages, TV, and now 5G down the line. So I guess we're kind of in the very early stages of this deployment, and I guess some of the work we've been doing just with some of our partners and looking at coverage, even with 4G, as I showed with the Ireland map. When you take that into a city, we definitely don't have great coverage in buildings. Once you go into those big glass buildings and docklands, you're losing connectivity, and it's going to be a big challenge as we go towards millimetre wave frequency in terms of getting that coverage into buildings in our cities, which is going to be something we need to think about in terms of how do we enable that. And I think just the context in terms of the mobile operators, they find it very challenging in terms of the investment model, the capex, the amount of money they're making from networks is challenging globally. You see from that chart there in terms of the decline, in terms of revenues. And also they're not making any money from it. So these are the guys making all the money off the network. So that's a super challenge for operators making the case to invest in these networks when other people are going to make all the money. And that's why network slicing and stuff like that with 5G probably has an opportunity to transform that. And this is the net neutrality argument in terms of, who gets the right access and what the speeds are. And also we're seeing massive, increase in consumption of data. Who knows what the new MoMo, is it MoMo, the network they launched?
Movo.
But this unlimited kind of data, it's only going to be good if you can actually GOMO. Is it GOMO? GOMO. So you're going to have lots of, how do we maintain this kind of growth in data when everyone just wants to consume data? What impacts do we have on networks, etc. is a big challenge. And then as we move towards this world of 5G and connectivity, we're going to have to figure out how do we densify our networks, we need more capacity. So these are the type of things that we need to kind of think about. And I guess for cities, how do we respond to this when there's going to be much more demand on our assets? So how do we kind of connect these things to our assets and power? Oh my God, that's the biggest pain in the ass, getting access to power. If anyone is in this space, it can take months. The cost can be huge, and the business model is down the tubes in terms of just getting one pole or small cell connected in our cities. Just think about how you scale that. So the rules and policies and regulations are going to be really something that we need to change fast if we're going to enable these networks to be built quickly at a price point that makes sense. So one of the projects we have in Docklands is how can we bundle all these connectivity options, how can we work with partners like Connect, and how can we innovate in terms of what the fundamentals of connectivity can do to transform our cities. And these are some of the technologies that we've rolled out across Docklands, but 5G is certainly one that's a real one for us to learn about how do we engage with these technologies and create a difference. So we engaged the market about 3 years ago, looking at, what's happening in this market engagement notice, gigabit Wi-Fi wireless, and just by chance, one of the companies that came back to us was a company called Dense Air, who just bought some spectrum on the 3.6 gigahertz and wanted to build a pilot network. So we built a pilot 5G neutral host network in Docklands with Dense Air and partnered with Connect, just to understand what does it take to build these networks, what does the coverage look like, what's the impact of buildings, etc. So we put in a few massive MIMO macro sites. We put in 20 small cells across the Docklands area and these magic boxes that help get better coverage indoors. So with this network then, working with research partners, we can really understand what it takes to build, what the costs are, and what the network coverage is, and actually help that, use that information to make a decision in terms of how we do this at scale across the city, across Dublin. And I guess the key principles that we're kind of thinking about from the city is we don't want this, lots of digging and everyone building their own networks and disrupting the streets. We don't want this real property looking, deployments on our poles. So we want to try and figure out how can we do a neutral host deployment where we get multiple operators to work together to deploy equipment or the services collectively. I think that's the big kind of debate globally in terms of how can cities enable that in a much more effective way. What we're doing with Dense Air as part of the experiment is how could you bring multiple operators to leverage this equipment and how could you minimise the number of small cells, etc., that are deployed in our cities, and how can you split that revenue and share the network. Now this is very disruptive and very challenging, so it may or may not work, but certainly by us putting this network out, we're exploring the appetite of the operators to work on that. So this is the type of stuff we don't want. I mean, that's probably typical. Anyone's in the US, those type of things are quite common. We want nice kind of aesthetics. I know when Dunleary trades, you built one of these with Signal, yeah, which is kind of multiple operators in the one pole. Look at this. I'm not going to put a small cell on that beautiful aesthetically, but our street lighting guys don't want me to put one on anyway. So it's kind of managing things like aesthetics and heritage. And even what we're learning is kind of, what about our traffic infrastructure, our ducting, our fibre? How can we leverage already existing infrastructure that's already there with power and agreeing the service level agreements that enable assets to be deployed on that is really important. And you see the Big Belly bin guys, we have an innovation partnership with them, and this is an example of a deployment in Boston where they've actually got a small cell deployed within a double kind of Big Belly bin unit. So there's different innovative ways to use street furniture to deploy these new networks, and that's the type of stuff we're trying to really innovate in, with the telecoms built into the bin and kind of making the clutter, less clutter in the street. So that's the real whole innovation piece, and I know a lot of cities are looking into these type of innovation. So again, just to kind of conclude, there's a big densification challenge will be, well, for our cities, how do we get the right locations, power, fibre, how would you price for that, and how do we build these networks? They're the type of things we really need to work out from a city perspective and work with government departments. What's the condition of assets? Just because you've a pole doesn't mean you can just stick a small cell on it. There's infrastructure challenges, there's getting fibre up that pole, there's wind shear. In fact, actually, probably 90% of our assets may not be suitable for just sticking some of this infrastructure up. So what does that mean? Also the power issue, this is the bit that's just really the blocker massively. So we're working with the SBN on a project to make it easier to deploy small cells, and what could that look like? And then, the big issue in terms of health concerns. I mean, anyone in the room here worried about 5G and health?
Oh, wow, this is great. Sure, we're getting questions.
It's a big issue, and there's kind of a percentage of scientists and academics that will have a view, and they've written a letter. I think it's about 180 academics globally, and that seems to be what we get pushed on us. I know Jake in the department has been working with you guys, and the EPA now have statutory responsibility to kind of look after citizens and advise state bodies on the health issues. But we're starting to get a kickback in terms of why you give permission to companies to put up these 5G infrastructure on your poles. We disagree with it. The millimeter wave frequencies frying our brain cells. So there's all sorts of there's a big debate to be had. I mean, we take guidance from the World Health Organization and the EPA, and we'll do this until we hear any other evidence otherwise for not doing it. I think that's pretty much the stance from the national government, who we're auctioning off spectrum. There's more spectrum in auction. This is a roadmap. We're working with the department, and I know with Sligo as well, in terms of how do we capture all this into a document that can help local authorities in their kind of ambition for 5G and densification of networks. 5G, if you look at the journey in Ireland, we're just at the start. I mean, really, we're not going to see this at scale for another 4 or 5 years at least. The densification won't really kick off for another 3 years. So if we can get the regulations and policies in place now, we're in with a chance of having a globally competitive infrastructure that can really help what people talking about well in terms of thriving communities and smart cities and towns and villages across Ireland. And just to kind of finish up, it's a complicated ecosystem, 5G in Ireland. You've got the mobile operators, you've got people who provide the infrastructure on behalf of the mobile operators, you've got the equipment vendors, you've got people trying to disrupt the equipment vendors, you've got the local authorities who have planning regulations that are not so consistent across the local authorities that create challenges. You've got asset owners within the departments, you've asset owners like ESB networks, others not figuring out how they can leverage those. You've got an R&D side that's trying to innovate in 5G and future networks, and then you've economic development. And so it's a really complicated landscape, and I think when we started this paper we didn't realise how complicated it was. It's like Pandora's box. But if we can figure all this out, I think there's a great opportunity. We need to join up across government and cities that we are well positioned to deploy this, and I think just what we don't want is operators cherry picking assets in cities. We want to make sure there's not a big digital divide. We want to have fair rollout, and we want to make sure that we're able to support this in a way that has the best outcome for citizens and communities.